Hello everybody, thank you for joining me. My name is Mitch Miller. I'm a licensed professional counselor in the West Bend area. Today I'm going to be giving a talk, which is the same talk that I gave recently at the 3 local parishes in the area here in West Bend, talking about mental illness, talking about depression and anxiety from a Christian and Catholic perspective. I was inspired to cover this information and to start giving talks because in my private practice, since COVID has started, I've been averaging probably 2 to 5 people per week who have been reaching out for therapy, and this is more people than I can possibly see. And all therapists are booked out with long wait lists, and so I was thinking we need to find a different way of serving people. We need to find a better way of serving more people, and so I wanted to start sharing some of what I've learned about mental health with a larger audience so that I can reach more people than just one at a time, which is what I normally do in therapy. So let's get started. So the first thing, we live in a very chaotic world. Life is changing very rapidly, and the pace of change is increasing, becoming more and more rapid and unpredictable. We have smartphones, we have social media, we have a 24-hour news cycle, data saturation. This leads to stress. Anytime there's unpredictability and overstimulation, this creates stress. So a couple of experimental examples of this. If you put a rat in a cage and you give it shocks intermittently, it's going to create stress for the rat. But if you give the shocks at a predictable pattern, this rat's going to be less stressed out than if you give the shocks in a totally random pattern. Furthermore, if the rat has control over the shocks, whether it gets shocked or not, if it can avoid the shocks, it's going to be less stressed. So if you put a rat in a cage, this is an experiment they did by a guy named Martin Seligman. And they put a rat in a cage, and this cage was split into 2. And one half of the floor of this cage would electrify, and the other half didn't electrify. And they would electrocute the rat through the floor at various intervals. And they would give like a little ring to tell the rat, you're about to be electrocuted. Well, didn't take the rat a long time to figure out that when I hear that ring, I better move over to the other side of the cage so I don't get shocked. And the rat would do that every time. It would hear the pitch. But then they did something really, really interesting. They actually put a divider down the middle. They put a glass pane down the middle of the cage so that the rat would hear the ring and get electrocuted, but it couldn't cross over to the other side. And so it would try to cross over, but it couldn't because there's glass in the way. And then it would get shocked. And after a while, what happened is the rat stopped trying. It stopped even trying to get to the other side. And eventually, they pulled out the glass pane from between the 2 halves, and even then, the rat still did not even try to get to the other side. They call this learned helplessness, and this is a big component of depression. People with depression don't have motivation to even try to do things to improve their lives because they've been beaten down so much by stress over and over and over again. And I think right now that's the world we live in. I think a lot of people feel beaten down by so much stress, and they have so much lack of control. It's like that glass pane has been slid in between us and freedom, between us and not getting shocked for so long that even when the glass pane is removed, we don't see it, and we just sit there and allow ourselves to get shocked because we are so lost and hopeless at times. So what I'm hoping is that as a community, especially in the Catholic community in West Bend, we can do a better job of supporting each other and returning that sense of control, that sense of predictability to our lives so that we don't feel so depressed and helpless. And that's going to involve a lot of work together as a community, not just seeing an individual therapist, but supporting each other. Next thing I want to talk about is a really important concept to understand in mental illness, is the concept of feedback loops. So you know what a feedback loop is? It's the idea is you have A causes B, and then B causes A. Okay, so if you think about, like, you've got a microphone, okay, you're talking into the microphone, that's A. But then talking into the microphone makes sound come out of a speaker somewhere, that's B. Okay, but what happens when you put the microphone in front of the speaker? A causes B, and B causes A, and it's going to get louder and louder and louder and louder. That's a feedback loop. We see these happening in mental illness all of the time, and it becomes a runaway cycle. So a good example of this is you could have a stressor, which leads to anxiety, which leads you to do worse at your job, which might lead to engaging in drinking or other maladaptive behaviors, which then leads to social problems. Maybe you don't get along as well with your spouse or your kids or your wife, which then leads to more stress, more anxiety, doing worse at your job, more drinking, more failure, more stress, and so the cycle just keeps going. And I think that's what we're stuck in for a lot of people with this current situation with COVID, is they have a stress, they don't know how to cope with the stress, and so they don't handle it well, and they handle it in bad ways that makes their life even more complicated, which leads to more anxiety, which leads to more failure, more stress, so on and so forth. I had a guy recently I was working with. He was laid off from his job because of COVID during March early on. He had been working for many, many years full time, and this is the first time he didn't have anything to do with himself. That job gave him structure. And so what he started to do is he started to drink. When he started to drink, he got into fights with his family, which made him feel depressed, which made him drink more, which made him get into more fights with his family, which led to more stress, more depression, and he got himself into a full-fledged addiction. And he was drinking every day, like a 6-pack a day. I can't remember exactly, but he was drinking a lot. So again, this is an illustration of these feedback loops, and some of you people might know in your own lives experiences or people that you care about who have had experiences with these feedback loops. So what we're trying to do in therapy and in support groups, which I hope that we can get started, is to intervene on these feedback loops. You've got A, which causes B, which causes C, which causes D, which causes A, B, C, D. We want to find where's the easiest place to break the cycle. And my argument to you is that one of the easiest and most effective places you can break the cycle is with social support, is with connecting with other people who are struggling and supporting each other, and trying to break the cycle by breaking some of these isolation patterns, some of these addictive patterns, maladaptive beliefs, self-hatred, etc. Social support is probably one of the most bang for your buck ways of breaking the cycle. So I'm going to give a historical example of this. If you think about World War II versus the Vietnam War, okay, both wars were horrific, but the Vietnam War had higher rates of PTSD than World War II. Why? Well, there's probably a lot of reasons why, but there's at least 2 reasons that I want to bring up here. First off, in World War II, when they came back to America, they came over in boats. So they came across the Atlantic or across the Pacific. That's a long ride. That takes several days by boat to go across the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean. And what do you think they were doing on those boats on the way back home? They were talking to each other. They were talking about their experiences in the war. They were talking about their dreams for the future, and they were starting to give context to this experience that they had. In the Vietnam War, they came over in planes. That takes a day. So they're not talking to each other. They're probably grabbing a nap on the way back. In addition, when they got back from World War II, they were celebrated. They were encouraged to talk about their experiences. They were heroes. When they got back from the Vietnam War, they were not celebrated. They were ostracized. They were demonized. They were vilified. And so they're not encouraged to talk about and process these things. When we don't understand our thoughts and feelings, they become more mysterious to us. They become more foreign. They become more scary. The more we can demystify our own thoughts, our own feelings, our own behaviors, the less scary they become. And the most natural way where we demystify this is by talking to each other. Our lives are very complicated, and we're not meant to try and make sense of them on our own. We do better when we talk to other people. We can learn from their experiences, and they can learn from ours. We can share perspective. And that's where we learn how to deal with these feelings and how to make sense of them. If we don't do that, we're left trying to figure it out for ourselves. And very often, our feelings we don't understand. They're mysterious to us. We might be having emotions we don't even know we're having. We might be angry and don't even realize that we're angry. We wake up in the morning and we're bitter and abusive towards our friends and family, and we don't even realize that we're being bitter and abusive because we haven't stopped to reflect on our feelings. We might have thoughts, hostilities towards other people, sadness, depression, that we don't even realize that we're having, and we may act it out. And other people are a better judge of what we're going through than we are because we don't understand our feelings. So talking to people, again, we need to talk to each other to help ourselves understand our feelings better and do a better job of managing them. So throughout this talk, I want that to be sort of the backdrop, that social support is necessary, and it's one of the most bang for your buck ways that you can break the feedback loop and improve mental health in the community. Part 2. So what is mental illness? So it's difficult to come up with a rigorous definition of what is mental illness and what is mental health. And there's a lot of reasons for this. First one is that it's just difficult to come up with a rigorous definition of what health is versus illness in general. So if we think of what, for instance, is a healthy body weight, well, it depends. It depends on a large variety of factors. Someone who weighs 200 pounds might be much healthier than someone who weighs 120 pounds. Maybe there's a height difference. Maybe the person who's 200 pounds is more active. Maybe there's a diet difference. Maybe there's a genetic difference. For instance, in Japan and most Asian countries, people produce less insulin, and so they can get diabetes more easily. So a healthy body weight for them is going to be totally different than a healthy body weight for, say, a Samoan, where they have lots of insulin and they can put on a lot of pounds. So that's the first thing. The second thing, as you probably already realized, is there's a spectrum. You know, weight is on a spectrum. You could have a healthy weight somewhere in the middle, which is already difficult to define, as we've established. You can be overweight, you can be very overweight, and you could be severely overweight. And the same thing on the other side. You could be healthy weight, you could be underweight, you could be very underweight, you could be severely underweight or anorexic. And it's the same thing with depression. You could have a healthy level of anxiety, you can be over that level or under that level to various degrees. So that's another thing that makes it hard to establish what is and isn't mental illness. I think a lot of people, when they come to a therapist or a psychiatrist or psychologist, are looking for like a scientific answer, like what is the answer, what is the diagnosis, what is the definition of what I'm going through and what is healthy and what is not. And the thing is it's very difficult to establish that because there's so many factors. And this is a point I really want to drive home. Mental illness involves so many factors. We treat mental illness as one thing, but in reality, it's like a whole big bunch of different things that we all just treat together as one. But it's really a cluster. It's really like 100, maybe 1,000 different things that we put together under one word or one name. So it's really difficult to say what mental illness is. It's not just one thing. It's a lot of different things. Part of it will be, like we said with the height analogy, part of it will be your body chemistry, what your hormones are like, how much testosterone you have, how much estrogen, how much progesterone, how many neurotransmitters you have, dopamine, serotonin, epinephrine. Some of it's going to have to do with your social life. You know, where are you in the pecking order? Are you have high socioeconomic class? Are you of low socioeconomic class? Do you have a job? Do you have hobbies? Some of it's going to have to do with behaviors. Your sleep. Are you getting enough sleep? Are you not getting enough sleep? Are you eating too much? Are you eating too little? Are you getting exercise? Are you not getting exercise? Some of it's going to have to do with whether you feel your life is meaningful. Maybe you are healthy on all these other areas. You have a good social life, you have a good job, you have a good diet, you get enough sleep, but your life just doesn't feel meaningful, it feels empty. And that's another factor. There's also cognitive factors. Maybe you have, like that rat in the previous example in the cage, maybe you have learned helplessness. Maybe you have learned how to be depressed and how to feel helpless in your situation. And you need to unlearn it. So there's so many factors. There's diet, exercise, sleep, neurotransmitters, hormones, there's psychological learning factors, there's meaning and spiritual factors, existential factors, philosophical factors, and all these come together under one thing that we call mental health. When in reality, it's a whole bunch of different things that are all independent of each other, but they all come together and they all have a mutual influence on your mental health. Another thing that makes it difficult to define mental health is it's culturally defined. If you live in a culture that people tend to be more angry or people tend to be more depressed, the expectations of that culture are going to be different than if you live in a culture that is very happy-go-lucky, for instance. Every single one of the diagnostic categories we use as professional therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists is created by a committee. What they do is they get the American Psychiatric Association. Every so many years they call together a conference of people, a whole bunch of people, and they set up these work groups with different psychologists and psychiatrists and therapists who are experts in mental illness, and they basically take a vote. They say, and they decide by voting what are the diagnostic categories that we're going to use for billing insurance companies, for research, administration, etc. And those categories have changed over time. They're not the same, and they're not always the same across cultures. There are certain diagnoses that exist in some cultures that don't exist in America. So a specific example of this, in the Catholic community, there is a category that we use to describe what we might know as a mental illness that's not in any statistical manual, and that would be scrupulosity. So scrupulosity is a problem where people are going to confession 2 or 3 times a day. They're obsessing about sin and things like that. And it looks a little bit like obsessive compulsive disorder, but it's not exactly the same thing. There's a cultural context in which we understand scrupulosity. So that's another thing that makes mental illness difficult to understand and difficult to explain, is it's culturally defined. It's subjective. We define these things based on our subjective experience of symptoms. There are objective components in it, so we can measure someone's heart rate and someone's breathing who has a panic disorder, for instance, and we can see how their body responds differently to stress than how a person without panic disorder responds to stress, for instance. And those are objective measurements. But the disorder itself, what qualifies as a panic disorder, what doesn't, is very largely subjective. And a lot of times people will read through the DSM categories for various mental illnesses, and they'll think, oh boy, I must have this disease, I must have this illness because I really resonate with this symptom and that symptom and that symptom. And they might come to a therapist and they might say, oh, I think I really have this problem. And they'll say, this resonates with me, that resonates with me, that resonates with me. But relative to other people who are seeing that therapist, I've seen this all the time. There are people who come to me and they think, oh, I think my husband's a narcissist. And they'll say, well, he's this, he's this, he's this, he's this. And I'll tell them, no, your husband's not a narcissist. You guys just haven't learned how to communicate with each other. You don't know how to agree with each other. Everybody has some of those traits. Everybody has some narcissistic traits. What qualifies as clinical versus unclinical, what qualifies as a diagnostic mental illness versus not, is very subjective and very hard to say. So that's another piece that makes it difficult to define mental illness. Something else I want to talk about is the idea of descriptive diagnosis. Every single diagnosis in the DSM is descriptive. What does that mean? That means it's just a collection of symptoms. So, for instance, a cold. You go to your doctor with a cough, with a fever, maybe with a headache, and you tell your doctor, I have a cough, I have a fever, I have a headache, and your doctor's going to tell you that could be one of maybe 1,000 different things. There's so many different things that could be. And in the DSM, every single diagnostic category that we use is just a collection of symptoms. A lot of people think that there's like a cause. It's mental illnesses. Diagnosis for mental illness is not like diagnosing cancer. It's not like diagnosing COVID. COVID, there's a specific virus that you can do a test for, and you can find that the virus is either present or it is not. And the illness is caused by a virus. With cancer, you can do imaging and see either there is cancer present in the body or there is not cancer present in the body. And you can know you either have cancer or you don't. But with mental illness, it doesn't work that way. We can't just put an X-ray or an MRI on your brain and know that you're depressed, that you're anxious, that you're schizophrenic, that you're obsessive compulsive. It doesn't work like that. We can't take a blood sample and know that you have depression or anxiety or that you have a personality disorder. It's just based on description, what you look like on the outside. And so most of the disorders in the DSM share lots of symptoms in common. The overlap, if you think of a Venn diagram, you have a circle over here, you have a circle over here, and you have this overlapping part in the middle. And if you did a Venn diagram for all of the different mental illnesses, you'd see a ton of overlapping symptoms between just about any pair of mental illnesses in the DSM. Depression, anxiety, psychotic disorders, personality disorders, obsessive compulsive disorders, PTSD. And because of that, it can be really difficult to say what a person has. I want to break away from the idea that mental illness is a thing, that mental illness is like this specific thing. It's not like cancer, it's not like that. It's not like COVID, it's not like that. It's a cluster of a whole bunch of different things. And if we treat mental illness as a cluster of a whole bunch of different things that just happen to coincide, we have a lot more power in responding to it, because we're not looking for the cure for my depression or the cure for my anxiety, but rather a way to respond to symptoms, which is all that we can do. The science of mental illness is very young. We've only had it for about 1,000 years. It has changed a lot in the past 1,000 years. It will continue to change. And so we can't look for silver bullet solutions. We have to address the symptoms as they are. A lot of people come to me and they say, well, I'm anxious, what do I do? And I'm like, well, what would anyone do if they're anxious? Like, anxiety is a common human experience. I think people have this false idea that mental illness is rocket science. It's not rocket science, it's emotional. It doesn't take a rocket science or a therapist or a psychiatrist to help you necessarily work with these things. Your friend, your aunt, your uncle, your mom, your dad, your brother, your sister, they experience a lot of these things too, though it might not be to the same degree. So genetics is a big factor for mental illness. Mental illnesses do cluster in families. Okay, so if you took all of the people that have mental illness, maybe in a town of 10,000 people, and you looked at how closely related the different people were with different mental illnesses, you tend to find that mental illnesses more often than not run in families. Depression, anxiety, schizophrenia. So genetics is another factor that I don't want to neglect. But it's not the only factor, because some of you are in families where there is mental illness. And you also know that there are other people who don't have mental illness. In fact, you can put biological twins next to each other and they won't have the same rates of mental illness. You can have identical genes. I think the correlation rate is something like 75% or something like that. It's pretty high, but it's not 100%. You can have identical genetics. Maybe it's depression. You have an identical twin that has depression. That doesn't automatically mean that you will for sure have depression. This is, I need to talk about the diathesis stress model. Very important concept. So genes, in the past we thought about genes as sort of like a blueprint. And whatever the blueprint said, that's what your body was. That's who you were, was what your genes dictated. But recently, in the past probably 2 or 3 decades, we've learned that this is not the case. There's a new field that has come up that we call epigenetics. Epi meaning outside of or around, and then genetics. And basically what this is the idea that your genes aren't a blueprint, they're more like a switchboard. And each person is born with different switches. Our genes, instead of being like ironclad ways that we for sure will be, are rather switches that represent a realm of possibilities. Okay, a switch can be turned on or off. Some switches can be turned up to 1 or to 2 or to 3. They can be turned on, but to different degrees. This is more like what our genes are. And our genes turn on and off in response to our life experiences. Maybe it's exposure to chemicals. Maybe it's extreme stress. And we see that in depression, in anxiety, in PTSD, in a lot of mental illnesses, we see patterns where mental illness runs in families and even in biological twins, but it's not 100%. And the way to understand this is through the diathesis stress model, or epigenetics. Me and my biological twin, we have the same genes. But I go through a severe stress. Maybe it's a car accident. Maybe I experience some form of abuse. Maybe I'm attacked. Maybe I'm chased by a bear in the middle of the woods. But my twin over here doesn't go through that stress. I develop depression. My twin does not develop depression. So we have a realm of possibilities in our genes that get turned on or turned off, get actualized in tandem with our experiences in life. They're like a switchboard, not like a blueprint. The biological component of mental illness, examples of this would be like, I can cause you to have a panic attack if I inject sodium lactate into you. It induces a panic attack. So mental illness is not purely subjective, it's objective too. Vitamin D. Most people in the Midwest are vitamin D deficient. This correlates with higher rates of depression. If you increase your vitamin D and get it more in balance, rates of depression go down. Okay, now I want to talk about medications and mental illness. So we were talking about what mental illness is, what it isn't. Again, we have this idea that it's a whole bunch of different things that we treat as one category, but it's not one category. We just treat it like one category, just because that's how we wrap our minds around it. What about medications? Okay, so I mentioned that neurotransmitters are a part of mental illness. Some of you may have heard of the chemical imbalance theory of depression. basically it goes like this. Depression is caused by a lack of or imbalance of serotonin in the brain. Well, that was super popular for most of the late 20th century, except we now know that it's not true. How do we know that it's not true? Because we know that serotonin imbalance or deficiency is neither a necessary nor a sufficient cause for depression. There are people with serotonin imbalances that have depression, and there are people who have serotonin imbalances that don't have depression. Likewise, there are people who don't have serotonin imbalances that have depression, and there are people who don't have serotonin imbalances that do have depression. So we know that the chemical imbalance theory is not a correct way of viewing mental illness. All of the evidence for that theory comes from the idea that people who take SSRIs, take drugs that affect serotonin, tend to be less depressed. But not everybody who takes these drugs gets better. And these drugs affect a whole bunch of things, many of which we don't fully understand. There is no medication in psychiatry that was designed from the ground up to treat a mental illness. Virtually all the medications that we use in psychiatry were first created to deal with other things, like blood pressure, for instance, or maybe an infection or something like that. And what they started coming up with in the 50s and 60s is they started noticing during clinical trials of these blood pressure and other medications that people who took them who also had depression tended to get better. And so they started asking themselves, maybe we should look into this. And they did, and they found that, yep, on average, people who take those medications, who have depression, who have anxiety, do get better. And so what they did is they repurposed those same exact drugs, remarketed them as mental health medications, and the rest is history. Virtually every single medication in psychiatry was created that way. So neuroscience and psychiatry are very young sciences. Everything in psychiatry is a process of trial and error. It's not like rocket science where you have it down to like specific numbers and charts and stuff like that. No, everything in psychiatry is trial and error. And some psychiatrists have more experience with trying certain drugs than other drugs. They have more experience treating more people and more cases, but ultimately it boils down to trial and error. No one can look at you and give you a medication and tell you for sure how that medication is going to affect you before you take it. No, you try the medication, they see how it affects you, and then they decide, do we up the dose, do we lower the dose, do we add a new medication, do we take out a medication? That is psychiatry in a nutshell. It's not a rigorously defined science. And it's the same with everything in mental health. In therapy, no one can do a therapy with you, start a therapy with you, and know for sure how it's going to impact you in the long run. We try things out, we try to see what works and what doesn't work, and then we try to learn from that. The best attitude is to just acknowledge that it's not a rigorous science, that it's going to involve a lot of trial and error, and have realistic expectations about what medications can do for you and what they can't do for you. Have realistic expectations about what a psychiatrist can do for you, what a psychiatrist can't do for you. So in summary, the main points I want to get home from this section is that mental illness is a category that contains a lot of different things. We treat it like it's one thing, but in reality it's probably 100 or maybe even 1,000 different things that we just lump together under one heading. Next, I want to talk about the theology of mental illness. Okay, so in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He created man, he created all the animals, he created everything. He created man with emotions, and he created emotions good. We're meant to have emotions. Emotions are not bad. This is one of the differences between Christian views of a human being and Stoic views. Stoics tend to see emotions as bad. They think everybody should be like Mr. Spock from Star Trek. Emotions are what keep us from reason and from better judgment. That's a Stoic view. That's not a Christian view. As Christians, we believe that God created us with emotions, and that that's part of His design, and that our emotions were created good. Originally, when He created us in the Garden of Eden, there was no suffering. We had perfect willpower, and the dogmatic language we use to talk about that is we had integrity of the will. When I saw something was good, I had the will to do it. When I saw something that was bad, I had the will to avoid it. We had integrity of the will. We had preternatural knowledge. What does preternatural knowledge mean? Preternatural knowledge means that all of the information and all of the intellect that you could fit inside of a human brain, we had that. We were as smart as human beings could be. In the Garden of Eden, before the fall, we were smarter than Einstein. We were smarter than Isaac Newton. We were smarter than the smartest people since the fall. We were as smart as a human being could be. We had immortality. That's the fourth thing. We had immortality. There was no death. There was no injuries. There was no sickness. And lastly, there was universal peace and harmony. There were no wildfires. There was no COVID. There were no pandemics. There were no hurricanes. There were no riots. There were no animals feasting off of each other and living only by predatorial activity on each other. Everything was in harmony. Everything was in balance, and everything was good. There was no suffering. There was no strife. There were no disasters. But then what happened? Man sinned. We call this the fall as Catholics. And because man sinned, we lost our lack of suffering. In came suffering. Because we sinned, suffering entered the picture. Concupiscence entered the picture. We lost our integrity of the will, and that became concupiscence. No longer can I do the thing that I know is good to do, or avoid the thing that I know is bad. Sometimes it's really hard for me to do the thing that I know is good, and I might not be able to do it because I lack the will, or I lack the will to avoid the thing that I know is bad for me. That's what we call concupiscence. We lost preternatural knowledge, and in its place, we have ignorance. We don't know the things that we could know, and sometimes the things that we should know. We lost our immortality and became mortal. Now we are subject to death. We are subject to disease. We are subject to starvation. These are things that did not exist prior to the fall. And lastly, the fall not only impacted us, but it impacted all of the universe. That sin went through the entire universe like a ripple out from a stone falling into a pond to expand to affect the entire universe. And now we have wildfires. We have earthquakes. We have natural disasters. We have pandemics. We have hurricanes. We have diseases. All of these things did not exist prior to the fall. Everything that is wrong with the world is the result of the fall and our sin. So what does this have to do with mental illness? Well, mental illness is one of those products of the fall. It includes several parts: ignorance, concupiscence, and suffering, as well as probably a little bit of the universal discord and chaos. It affects multiple dimensions, not just one dimension. It affects our mind, it affects our body, it affects our soul, it affects our learning, our psychology, it affects our morality. It's a whole bunch of different things. Remember, it's that same idea over again. It's not just one thing, it's a whole bunch of different things. As Christians, one of the ways that we conceptualize this is through vices and virtues. That's one of the ways that we try to understand mental illness. In the early church, the Desert Fathers were people who left society to go live as monks and monastics in the middle of desert, many of them in caves. So St. Anthony is one of the most famous and earliest examples. And these monks in the desert came up with what was called the 8 logoismoi. And logoismoi is a Greek word that means the 8 passionate thoughts. And those were pride, vanity, acedia, avarice, gluttony, wrath, lust, and sadness. And these 8 logoismoi later became what we now know as the 7 deadly sins. And we saw these things as a combination of different factors, some of them natural and some of them supernatural. So these fathers, these desert fathers, these monks out in the desert, saw some of these vices as coming within me, in my own mind, but some of them they saw as coming from outside of my mind. It's like you have the demon over here on your shoulder, whispering things in your ear, telling you all the things that make you angry, or maybe lustful, or maybe gluttonous, or maybe greedy. And then over here, you have the angel, which is trying to help you, your conscience, trying to help you make the right choice. And so this is the way we understand mental illness from a Christian perspective, is that it involves natural parts, but it also involves supernatural parts. You have all these vices, and these vices are not just emotions, they are also demons. And if you think about it, it's not all that different from the way we think about bacteria and virus and infection today. You can have an infection, you have all these invisible things all around you at any point in time, and any one of them can make you sick if you're not careful. If you don't wash your hands right, or if you go into a really dirty place and you don't handle things right, or you get cut, and then in comes the infection, you're taken over, and your whole body gets sick. This is similar to the way that the early Christians thought about mental illness. There were different places where you could encounter these demons that would attack you. And you don't necessarily know where they are. They're everywhere. They're everywhere. And God gives you a spiritual immune system to sort of block them off, and He only allows you to be attacked by certain ones at certain times. But not only that, you can notice sometimes when you're being attacked by them. You can notice when you have this demon whispering in your ear, these greedy, wrathful thoughts, these lustful thoughts. And you can push back against them. You can reject those thoughts. Oh, that person who said that thing to you the other day, man, what a jerk. Maybe I should get revenge on him. Or how can I cheat my coworkers out of some of their wage? How can I cheat some of my employees out of their wage and have more money for myself? Or how can I get out of doing the least amount of work for my team at work? Or doing the least amount to help out my family and my coworkers? How can I be as lazy and slothful as possible? And you will hear these things in your mind. And sometimes they come from spiritual forces. And we need to recognize that, because if we don't recognize that, it's the same as recognizing a bacteria or a virus. As soon as you know the bacteria and the virus is there, you can clean the area, you can respond to it, or if you get infected by it, you can now respond to it, take more vitamin C, go and see a doctor, take your medication, etc. It's the same idea. Okay, so again, just to reiterate, mental illness is a complex thing. So far we've talked about biology, we've talked about psychology, we've talked about genetics, neurotransmitters, and now we're talking about the spirituality of it. We can never fully overcome this. Even if we do the very best job of pushing back against the demons, of praying, of avoiding temptation, we will never fully overcome it. It's the same as bacteria. You can do everything in the world and try to cover everything with bleach. You are never going to get rid of all of the bacteria. You are never going to get rid of all of the suffering in the world. Suffering is a permanent feature of reality until Christ comes again. When Christ comes again, He will make everything better. Things will be even better than they were before the fall, because we will not only be having preternatural knowledge and all those other gifts, but we will get to partake and share in the divine nature itself. We will get to participate in the very essence and being of God. And when we take the Eucharist, for example, that is a foretaste of that participation in the divine nature. So things are going to be even better, but until then, we have to deal with suffering. We can't get rid of it no matter how badly we want to. We could do everything perfectly. There is still going to be some suffering. What can we do? Well, we have control over whether our suffering is redemptive or non-redemptive. What does that mean? Non-redemptive suffering is suffering that has no meaning. Okay? So if I'm an alcoholic and I'm getting drunk every single week and drinking myself into a stupor, there's going to be suffering associated with that. I might lose my job, I might lose a bunch of money, I might lose a bunch of friends, I might have a bunch of hangovers, might go through withdrawal, but that suffering doesn't help anyone in any way. That's non-redemptive suffering. Okay? Then there is redemptive suffering. Redemptive suffering is the pain that we feel as a result of doing the right thing. Sometimes doing the right thing is hard. That's redemptive suffering. Sometimes enduring the pain that we can't do anything about is redemptive. So you can take that depression, that anxiety that you have, and you can offer that up to God. And that depression, that anxiety, that mental illness, that struggle can be the basis of you being closer to God. It can strengthen your relationship with God. And it can also be a way for you to help your neighbor who also struggles with depression or anxiety or this or that thing, and it creates a stronger bond between you in the body of Christ and a stronger bond between you and God. A horizontal bond and a vertical bond. A good example of this is in St. Paul. St. Paul, as we know, he struggled with what he called a thorn in his side. And he said, Lord, please take this thorn from me. We know from his writings that he prayed over and over again that this thorn, whatever it was, we don't know what the thorn was. Different people have different guesses. He said, take this from me. And what did he say? What did God say to St. Paul? God said, my grace is sufficient for you. So God doesn't just take away our suffering. He takes away some of it, but he doesn't take away all of it. And he didn't do it for St. Paul. He didn't do it for Christ. He didn't do it for his own son. And as Jesus said, if I have to struggle in this way, if I have to suffer, how much more do you think you, who are not God, how much more do you think you will suffer? If they treat me this way, how much more do you think they're going to treat you this way? And this is the world. People will treat you poorly, and you'll have to endure some suffering there. But it's also the demons. The demons are going to treat you poorly. If the demons were terrified of Christ and they attacked him, how much more will the demons attack you, who they're not terrified of? So, do we just say, because we can't get rid of all suffering, that we should just throw up our hands and give up? What's the point? No, that's not the Christian way of thinking. There's actually a philosophy that's gotten more popular today called Anti-Natalism. Basically, it's the idea that since we can never get rid of suffering, it'd be better off if no one was ever born. Anti-Natalism, against birth. And I think it says something about the times that we live in and how complicated and chaotic and frustrating it is. Things are so bad right now that there's a popular philosophy that it's better off not even existing. This has never been a popular philosophy in the history of the world. And it's not a Christian view of things. As Christians, we embrace suffering. We see it as an opportunity to express love. We don't back down from it. Just like Christ didn't back down from the cross, we follow his example. But we don't want suffering to be any more than it has to be. So we want to reduce suffering, but we know that we're never going to fully eliminate it. In conclusion, we've just been talking about the theology of mental illness. Main points, mental illness is one of the consequences of the fall. It's one of the consequences of man having sinned in the world. Two, Because there's a theological aspect to mental illness, there are natural, like my body and the world, the things that we can see, there are natural factors, but there's also spiritual factors that we can't see. There's angels and demons fighting for our souls, and that's part of what's going on with mental illness. And lastly is that there's going to be suffering. Because it's a theological battle, there are going to be aspects of suffering that we can never fully root out. Does that mean we should just throw up our hands in despair and just give up? Or get angry at God because he's not doing things the way we want him to do? No, it means that we embrace the suffering. Why? Because Christ embraced the suffering. And in the suffering is where we find meaning. It's in that suffering that we find our souls. If we reject the suffering completely and we refuse to embrace it, we become cowards. And we become so invested in our own comfort that we never grow into the full beings that God wanted us to be. So next we're going to talk about natural aspects. We talked about the theology of mental illness. Now we're going to just talk about nitty-gritty natural aspects of depression and anxiety. Why depression and anxiety? Because these are the most common mental illnesses by far. So depression and anxiety are sort of like the common cold and the flu of mental illness. They manifest in, just like the common cold and the flu, they manifest in a lot of different ways. And there's no cure for depression or anxiety, just like the common cold and the flu. It's something that we learn how to live with, learn how to manage. Sometimes it might get worse, sometimes it might get better. Some people might experience it more often than others, but it's not something that we can fully root out. So we're going to talk about some basic statistics here. First, depression. Depression affects about 1 in 10 adults every year. It affects about 1 in 5 people in their lifetime. So about 20% of all people experience a depressive episode in their life. The average duration of a depressive episode is 9 months. What does that mean? That means that 50% of people have depressive episodes that last longer than 9 months, and 50% of people have depression that lasts less than 9 months, but the average is 9 months. It affects men and women about equally. Now, in the past, we used to think that women got depressed more often than men. But more recent data that I have looked at suggests that it's roughly the same, and that the reason why we used to think that it was different is because we weren't accounting for how many destructive behaviors men engage in to cope with depression. We were ignoring the depression in addiction. People who have addictions trying to cope with depression. So we weren't treating them as depressed, but they really are depressed. It's a cause of medical disability in about 1% of adults in this country. The estimated costs in the United States between years 2005 and 2010 was about $210 billion for those 5 years, 2005 to 2010. About 45% of that $210 billion went to treatment. 5% of that $210 billion went to costs related to suicide, that is coroner's fees, doctor's fees, lawyers' fees, etc., etc. And about 50% went to lost wages and productivity. People not going to work because they're too depressed to work, or they're going to work and they're not productive because they're so slow and so depressed that they're not getting anything done. 60% of people who commit suicide have a depressive disorder. Depressive disorders have increased an average of about 600% since the beginning of COVID in the United States. The United States is one of the top 5 worst countries for depression worldwide. Now, I looked at a few different figures, and some figures put the United States at the very top. Some of them put the United States further down. So I'm just going to be safe and say it's about the top 5 most depressed countries in the world. Now, we're not used to thinking of the United States as an unprivileged nation. You know, it's hard for us to think of the United States is very depressed because we have so much material wealth. But I want to remind people of what Mother Teresa said about the United States. Mother Teresa said the United States was one of the poorest places she had ever seen. And when people invited Mother Teresa to come and do ministry in the United States, very often she declined and says, no, we can't go there, it's too poor. It's too poor. Mother Teresa, who ministered to some of the poorest people in the world in Calcutta, India, said that the United States is too poor for her. And she said it's a spiritual poverty. And I think depression has something to do with it. As we already established, there's a theological aspect to depression. And I think that's partially what Mother Teresa is talking about. Is there's a spiritual poverty in the United States. It has something to do with mental illness. What does depression look like? So here's some of the common features. First is anhedonia. Anhedonia. Anhedonia is a fancy word which means you're not able to feel pleasure. Some of you may have heard the word hedonism. And a hedonist is someone who just lives for pleasure. They just live for sex and drugs and rock and roll, and that's a hedonist. Anhedonia is the inability to feel pleasure. So when you're really depressed, even the things that ought to make you feel good don't make you feel good at all. Having a good meal with family and with friends, you feel nothing. Having sex, you feel nothing. Listening to good music, going to a good concert, watching a good movie, you feel nothing. You're depressed, it's just flat. Or maybe even worse, you're just feeling awful, even when good things are happening around you. 2, obviously, depressed mood, even when there's no reason to be. Now, if you come to me for therapy and you tell me that you're depressed, and that your uncle just died, and you aren't making enough money, and you're upside down in your mortgage, and your children are hungry, and you just found out that you have a rare disease, and all these bad things are happening to me, I'm probably not going to diagnose you with depression, first and foremost. But if you come to me and you tell me that your finances are fine, your relationships are good, your job is okay, and yet you want to commit suicide, I'm probably going to look at the possibility of diagnosing you with depression. So depression, you can feel awful and depressed even when you have no good reason to be. 3, changes in sleep architecture. What is sleep architecture? Well, some of you guys know that not all sleep is created equal. You have different stages of sleep. At the deepest level, you have REM sleep. You guys probably are familiar with that. But there's a few other stages in between. And so when you have depression, you might be getting 8 hours of sleep a night, but you might only be getting 8 hours of this shallowest level of sleep. And so you're not getting a full night's rest. You are sleeping for 8 hours, but you're not getting a full night's sleep. Each stage of sleep serves a different function, and your brain does different things at each stage. And if you're not going through the full cycle, there's going to be all kinds of emotional things that you don't experience. Consolidation of memories isn't going to happen if you don't go through a full cycle. Emotional processing won't happen if you don't go through a full cycle. So your sleep architecture changes. You might be sleeping, you might be in bed for 12 hours a day, every single day, and still be exhausted all of the time, mentally and maybe even physically. Part of that has to do with the sleep architecture. You're not getting a full night's sleep. 4, feeling tired, feeling like you have no energy, feeling heaviness. 5, overeating, or the opposite, not eating at all. This is another one of those things I want you to remember. Mental illness is not one thing, but a whole bunch of different things. And so there's room for contradictions here. Some people, when they get depressed, might eat a lot of food to try and compensate for that anhedonia. I don't feel any pleasure, so what am I going to do? I'm going to eat 10 donuts to try and make myself feel something, and I'm going to overeat. But other people, they don't feel any pleasure. They might not eat at all. They might just give up eating. And so that's one of the reasons why you can have contradictions in the symptomology for depression. 6, feeling bad about yourself or feeling bad about the world, feeling like you're a failure or like life or existence itself is hopeless. 7, difficulty concentrating and a lack of motivation, even to do things that you might otherwise love doing. Maybe you really love going to the movie theater, and your favorite movie of all time, like the movie that you've been waiting for years, is coming out in the theater, and now you're going through a depressive episode, and all of your friends want to go to the movies with you, and you just don't care. You have lost the will. You have no motivation to do it. 8, lethargy, slowing things down. Maybe you talk slow. You're going through sort of like an Eeyore syndrome. But it can also be the opposite. Remember, there's diversity here. Maybe you're really agitated. Maybe you're depressed, and you're like a stressful depressed, and you feel bad about yourself, like your life is meaningless, but you're tense, and you're agitated, and you're bitter, and you can get angry at people, and you lash out at them because you don't feel good about yourself or about the world. So they can look different. 9, thoughts of hurting yourself or that you would be better off dead. Okay, so as you can see with these symptoms, it's not just one thing. There's a whole bunch of different things going on here. So it's important that we remember not to treat it as just one thing. Next, we'll move on to anxiety. Anxiety affects about 1 in 5 adults in any year, and 1 in 4 people lifetime. So that's about 25% of people are experiencing an anxiety disorder. It affects about twice as many women as men. So this is a place where we see a significant sex difference in levels of anxiety. And this has a lot to do with biology. Women are built differently from men. They have different levels of different hormones in their body. And also social. Women are treated differently than men. They relate differently from men. There's different expectations of them in society than there are for men. People with anxiety disorders are at about a 600% increased risk of fatal heart attack. Anxiety disorders, more so than depressive disorders, have a higher risk of becoming chronic. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is that people who have anxiety, one of the most common ways that they respond to anxiety is through avoidance. Avoidance is a huge problem with anxiety, and I'll explain it like this. If you have social anxiety, for example, you are afraid of being in social environments. You're afraid of being judged, you're afraid people won't like you, you're afraid you'll make a fool of yourself, and so what do? You isolate yourself. But when you're isolated, what do? You ruminate. You just reflect on what a screw up you are, how you don't fit into society, and then whenever you are around people, you're that much more anxious. But if you would force yourself to stay in those social situations despite your anxiety, what would happen is the anxiety would tend to come down, and you would feel less anxious in social situations and more confident. So avoidance is one reason why anxiety disorders tend to become chronic. It's because when you feel anxious, you tend to avoid the thing that's making you anxious, which usually just makes things worse. The better response is to push into the thing that makes you anxious. Fight your fears, confront the dragon, fight the dragon, and push back. And then build more confidence in your ability to deal with things rather than try to hide from the thing that you're afraid from. In 1990 alone, the estimated costs of anxiety disorders in the United States were about $50 billion. Now remember, the previous figure for depression, that was 5 years. That was 2005 to 2010. In this figure, this is 1990 alone. So this is only 1 year. 1 year, $50 billion. 31% of that $50 billion went for the treatment of anxiety disorders. 10% went to lost productivity and wages. People who are having panic attacks and they're so nervous that they can't drive to work. They They can't even make it into the office that day. 54% of that $50 billion went into excess utilization of primary care services. When I was in my master's degree program, we were taught that the most commonly prescribed medication in the United States is Xanax. Xanax is a benzodiazepine. It works by slowing down your central nervous system. It slows down your heart, slows down your breathing, slows down everything, lowers your blood pressure, and because it slows down everything, you feel less anxious. But something else happens. People, when they're feeling anxiety and they don't understand what they're feeling, very often think they're having a heart attack. And what do? They go to the emergency room. And when I used to work at a hospital and I used to do rounds in the emergency room, every day there was someone there for an anxiety attack who thought they were having a heart attack. Now, that's in a hospital bed in the emergency room that can't be given to someone else. In addition, that's costs from the insurance companies, cost of the doctor's time, etc., ambulance, etc., that was unnecessary. That's another way that the cost of anxiety can explode, and that's part of the explanation why 54% of this $50 billion is excess utilization of primary care services. About 70% of people who attempt suicide have an anxiety disorder. Remember, the previous figure for depression was 60%, but it was for people who complete or commit suicide. This figure is for people who attempt suicide. 70% of people who attempt suicide have an anxiety disorder. Like depression, anxiety disorders have increased an estimated about 600% since the beginning of COVID. So since COVID has started, anxiety disorders are 6 times more prevalent than they were before. And probably more so than depression, anxiety disorders are a major cause of substance abuse disorders. Why? Because people use substances to cope with anxiety. They use alcohol, they use marijuana, they use opiates, they use all kinds of medications to try and feel less anxious. So that leads to addiction. When you have an anxiety disorder that doesn't just go away, and your only way of coping with it is with a medication or with a substance, it can very quickly create an addiction. Okay, next we'll talk about some of the features of anxiety. Sudden moments of panic, fright, or fear. Feeling anxious, nervous, worried, again, just like with depression, even when there is no good reason to be. Intrusive thoughts of bad things happening, such as tragedy, illness, accident, failure in your life. A good example of this would be like obsessive compulsive disorder, where you have all kinds of thoughts sort of shoving their way into your brain from the outside. Remember, this should remind you of what we talked about in the theology part. The demons are there, they are attacking you, and they might be injecting all kinds of thoughts into your head, messing with you to try and make you more depressed, more anxious, etc. So those intrusive thoughts of bad things happening is one of the ways that happens. Heart racing, your heart rate will go up when you're anxious. Sweating, muscle tension, restlessness, avoidance. We talked about avoidance a little bit ago. Difficulty making decisions. I have one particular person I work with who has a very hard time making decisions about what sports team he wants to follow, where he wants to work, whether he wants to date this person or date that person, and I've been working with this person for a couple of years now, and he still can't make some basic decisions about some very basic things in his life because he's so anxious about making the wrong decision. Frequently needing assurance from others because of anxiety. So likewise with this person, he's constantly turning to other people to help him make these decisions because he's not confident enough to make them himself. Finally, needing help to cope, such as through medication, through substances, through superstitions, like what we talked about with obsessive compulsive disorder. You might have an intrusive thought about your house burning down, and so you might check your oven 10 times every hour to make sure that it's not left on because you're afraid that your house is going to burn down. Or maybe you check the locks to your front door, a whole bunch of times. Or maybe you have intrusive thoughts about getting diseases, and so you wash your hands 1,000 times a day to the point where the skin starts to come off. Okay, next we're going to talk about risk factors. The risk factors are similar for depression and for anxiety, and they're pretty much the same risk factors for all mental illness. It has to do with your whole self, your whole body, not just your brain, but your brain, your hormones, your heart, your muscles, your whole body, your mind, your soul, your body, your mind, your soul, and then your social network. All of these can create risk factors for you. So the first one is genetics. As we said before, genetics, it gives you like this switchboard, and if you have the right switches and they get switched, you're going to get mental illness. Stress. Stress is what switches the switch on the switchboard to create mental illness when we talk about genetics and epigenetics. Genetics, stress, diet, poor diet and nutrition. So like a vitamin D deficiency, as we talked about before, but there's a whole bunch of other ones too. Unstable sleep, lack of exercise or a sedentary lifestyle, a chaotic living environment, social isolation, weak social connections, a lack of sense of purpose and meaning in life, the weather, when the sun's not out as often, when we go through daylight savings time, when it's cloudy, when a pressure center moves in and you get arthritis and you get pains, and those pains lead to depression. Financial insecurity, uncertainty about the future, a feeling of powerlessness in life, or like we talked about before, learned helplessness, lack of coping skills, again, giving you a feeling of powerlessness. You just have these feelings and you don't even know what to do about it. And finally, an illness or a compromised immune system. Those are the risk factors. What are the protective factors? Well, the exact opposite. Having genes that don't predispose you for depression, having well-managed stress levels or consistent stress levels, having a healthy diet and nutrition, stable and consistent sleep, regular exercise, having a living environment that isn't chaotic but feels safe, it gives you predictability and structure in life, having a life where you're not isolated but where you have lots of social support, you have lots of friends, not just one or two, but a diversity of friends where you can share different parts of your life with and not feel alone in any one thing. A sense of purpose or meaning in life, like your life is heading somewhere. And related to that is religious faith. A scientist by the name of Koenig, a researcher, has established that people with religious faith tend to have lower rates of depression and anxiety, specifically religious faiths that have a strong communal component. Feelings of autonomy. Instead of feeling powerlessness, you feel like you have some empowerment, you have some power in your life over what's happening, and you have choices, you have options. Instead of financial insecurity, having financial stability and economic stability, knowing that you have enough money to get through from one week to the next. Having a variety of coping skills. Again, a larger variety of coping skills is like having a larger variety of tools in your belt. You have more different things you can try before you've exhausted everything. And everybody should have a variety of coping skills. We're going to cover some in a little bit here. And lastly, a healthy immune system.